Law enforcement and detectives of Reddit. Have you ever stumbled upon a case that was unexplainable? If so, what were your thoughts, theories as to what happened, and what was the final conclusion of the case? The initial call was 2 dead, 1 with apparent gunshot wounds. Upon arrival we find a man in his 60s with half of his face missing, a gunshot to the chest, and a .30-06 rifle next to him laying in the kitchen. In the living room we find a female of same approximate age, deceased with no visible injuries or signs of death. In the backyard we found a shotgun laying in the grass. Long story short, the man had attempted suicide with a shotgun. It's not uncommon for people that try to kill themselves with shotguns to soon realize that holding a shotgun under your chin and being able to reach the trigger is no easy task. Due to the length of the shotgun, the man blew the front of his face off and he didn't die. He walked into the house where his wife saw his injuries. She then went into cardiac arrest and died. The man then went to his bedroom, grabbed the high-powered rifle, and shot himself in the chest. My friend's mum is a nurse. She told me a few years ago they had a woman wheeled in screaming and crying. She was really old and lived with her husband with a nurse to help them both. She wouldn't let anybody near her and just kept screaming. They noticed the bottom of her feet were completely black and she never stopped crying and screaming. The husband was reported missing or something and the police had investigated. Turns out the nurse living with them had chopped up the husband and burned him in the bathtub, then moved on to the woman and tried to put her in the bath, but she started kicking and screaming and her feet got covered in ash. One of the neighbors knocked on the door, so the nurse ran and the woman crawled out of the bathroom and locked the door, and the neighbor found her crying in the hall with bruises on her arms, so she was taken to the ER. I was in a junior police academy and one of the cops told us about a call they got a while back. And this is true, no joke. I'll tell it like a story with the details I know. A wife and husband had just recently got married and everything was all fine and dandy. They were just working towards the American dream house with white picket fence, 3 cars, 2.5 kids, you know how it is. Anyway, the husband and wife wake up one day and go about their usual routine. The husband kisses his wife goodbye and heads off for work. Nothing strange, except the wife notices the husband left his glasses, which she knew he really needed for his work. So she tries calling him. He doesn't pick up. She figures, what the heck, I'm not doing anything today, so she decides to drop off his glasses to him. His work wasn't that far anyways. So she gets in the car and heads off to her hubby's work. But as she's driving she sees a car pulled off on a dirt road and recognizes it as her husband's car. So she pulls off the main road and down the dirt a bit to see if she sees her husband. Sure enough, she sees him standing off to the side of the road a bit. She gets out of her car and calls out his name. He turns his head to look at her, lights a match, and instantly engulfs in flames. The cops showed us a picture of his body on fire in the fetal position, all charred. They never found out why he did it. No suicide note, no indication, nothing. That's some Stephen King crap right there. I do a lot of ride-alongs with police officers, and one time we got called to a gas station for a stabbing call. We arrive at the gas station and there is blood everywhere outside by the pumps. We go inside to talk to the manager and he said no one called, so we couldn't figure out what was going on. Another squad car stopped at the other gas station just to the north. Both gas stations have the same name, and it was the same thing. Blood everywhere by the pumps. So in the same night, we have 2 gas stations within a mile of each other that have blood everywhere outside. My thought was that he got stabbed at the south one. First one I described, and had his buddies drive up to the north one to get him help because the north one was closer to the hospital. Ended up that someone just had an extremely violent bloody nose at the south gas station after the officers reviewed the tapes. The guy actually did get shanked at the north one and his buddies drove him to the ER. But it was unexplainable for about a week until they reviewed every bit of the footage and interviewed the victim. Thank God I've never had a bloody nose bad enough that police or officers mistook the scene for a stabbing. Former police dispatcher. That said, this wasn't something I was involved with. Sorry, a lieutenant at my old department likes to tell the story of when he was a beat cop in northeastern Ohio in the 80s. They got a call of car parts floating in a lake. Fearing someone was trapped underwater, they called in a dive team who found 15 cars parked in a row, all from the 1950s era, about 25 feet below the surface. Due to water damage and rust, They appeared to have been sitting there for quite some time. It appeared that when they were left there they had been in perfect working order. All identification had been stripped off. The lake was natural and had been there forever. They never did figure out who put the cars there, how, or why. The lieutenant thinks it was a high school prank. I live in WA state, and the police still don't know why feet keep washing up on the shores around here. I can't remember how many, but one looked like a child's foot and possibly a younger woman's. It's just the foot. No one can figure out where in the heck they come from, and it's frightening irritating. My guess? Pirates. In the early 70s, my dad's best friend went missing from Red Wing, MN early winter and was later found floating by my best friend's mom. Freak coincidence. In Lake Pepin, Wisconsin dead. Cause of death and any details of the investigation were never released. Anyone out there familiar with this case? Is it bad? My first thought when I read your post was, oh hey, that's where Laura Ingalls Wilder lived. Strangest story I heard from a police officer colleague. A young woman's parents found her body in a chair at the dining room table where she had shot herself in the head. There was a letter on the table from Steven Tyler saying he was breaking up with her. Turns out she had told her mother she was in a new relationship with someone for the past couple of months, but he lived far away so they exchanged letters. At first it was unexplained and detectives thought someone had tricked her, because obviously she wasn't dating Steven Tyler. But then detectives found a box of the letters, both the ones sent to her and the ones she sent to Steven Tyler, in a box in her room. All were addressed to her house, and they determined all were written by her, just in different handwriting. So essentially she killed herself after breaking up with herself through a letter. In high school I worked in an antique shop for a few months for this older lady in town. We lived in a small town of about 3,000 people. Now this antique shop was kind of different. It was an old building, probably built in the 50s. So the front half of the building is just an old store, but the back half was some kind of American Express shipping place. Seriously, I have no freaking idea what the heck this lady did here. We had row after row lined with shelves and massive boxes containing everything from documents to random Amex merchandise. All I know is that we oftentimes had to get out certain file types from these boxes and package them in smaller boxes, then load them on a pallet and wrap it all up. We would package up about 20 pallets and a semi would eventually come pick them up. Anyway, one night after getting done I go home and do my normal nightly routine. We had a huge shipment of 30 plus pallets loaded with paper ready to go out in a few days. The boss lady is going to be staying there late, she says, to finish up last minute details. It's 4 in the morning of the following day and my friend who also works there calls me and tells me the building is on fire. I go drive by and sure enough, the building is ablaze. I think about how I now don't have a job and go back home. 20 minutes later I get another call from our friend, the owner of the store's daughter, and tells us that the owner was in the building and died in there. Skipping ahead, the fire department interviews all of us and asks questions. The fire was fueled by an absurd amount of paper in the building and the start of the fire can't be identified. They just basically say frick it and tell us they have no idea how this happened. The mystery of this is how the old lady paid us for the week. This is the middle of the week, not normal, the night before the fire. We never told anyone this, but we all kind of assumed this might have been intentional. We had heard stories about her having marriage problems at home, but nothing was ever confirmed. At the very least I just want to know how the fire started. Was it electrical from the old wiring? Did she fall asleep there and drop a lit cigarette? I want some closure. So I wrote this all out and quickly realized this might not be interesting at all to someone who wasn't associated with the events, but oh well, I'm keeping. Oh, can't forget, I'm not a detective, but this is actually story behind my handle. When I was 21 the love of my life fell off the grid. She graduated from Orp and the last I had heard she was going to weekend in Germany. All of her internet presence disappeared 5 days later. Her phone was disconnected within the week. I contacted her parents and they said they were troubled by the phone thing but had received a letter about an exciting opportunity in her handwriting. After a year I got postcard apologizing for disappearing, but everything was okay. 5 years pass and I would every now and then try to find a digital trace of her, just because of curiosity. Her dad emailed me saying they hadn't gotten a letter in a year. I spend most of my free time for 9 months digitally tracking her, piecing things together. Then I find a European credit agency who will work with me to get a credit report. They take the info and €200 and never respond. But I got an email from an unknown address saying I am alive. I am fine. You searching for me is making certain things problematic. If you love me you will stop. I never stopped and have started digitally tracking missing loved ones for people pro bono. I have some leads on C, and I'm going to Europe in 2014 to follow up on them. I worked a suicide where a guy shot himself in the head twice. He was a terminal cancer patient, so I never suspected murder. The three possibilities are that the gun misfired, muscle spasms after the first shot caused him to pull the trigger twice, or it was a mercy killing by his spouse. In the end, I contacted our homicide unit and they decided it was probably a misfire. My buddy remodels foreclosures to make them suitable to resell. Usually no more than picking up trash and repainting. His second week on the job he went into a house full of the bottom half of animals. Mostly cats and dogs. No top halves, just waists and below. HR counted 12 from where he was standing and noped all the way back to the truck to call hazmat. He told his boss about it, took the rest of the day off and noped all the way home to smoke weed. I'd like to believe that there's another house filled with only the top half of animals and that the crazy fricks that did it are long lost lovers. To satisfy your thirst for I'm not a detective, but the Phantom of Heilbronn. German police officers were chasing a phantom. It was really strange. They found the same DNA on a lot of seemingly unrelated crime scenes. There seemed to be one person responsible for theft, robbery, homejacking, murder on places throughout Germany and Austria. A nightmare for the detectives. Who was this mysterious woman and why did she kill random people and mix up big crimes and small crimes in very different places? My dad and I started to spin theories around this. My favorite was that a gang was holding a woman hostage and placed her DNA on those crime scene on purpose to set police on the wrong track. The solution was anticlimactic. The DNA belongs to a woman working in the company producing cotton swabs. They were contaminated with her DNA and left the police with a lot of now completely new cases, because all the evidence they thought they had was trash. Twist, she still totally did it and had the perfect alibi. Not a lot of folk, but my mom and little brother went missing. They just found our van on some really remote beach. I was there the day after they were reported missing. The owners of the property let my dad and I stay in the guest house, gave me sweets and stuff. Nice folks. And during the daylight I could not find the entrance to the beach until one of the FBI dudes showed me. Even after that I had to go down when one of the dogs and their handlers were going down, otherwise I'd get lost. The trail road didn't even seem big enough for our van to go down. But our van was parked on the beach, doors and trunk wide open with various personal effects from my mom and brother still in there. About 3 days later his body washed up on a beach that, from my understanding, is highly unlikely for the currents to have carried him there. For a few months after that I constantly had the sensation of being watched and monitored, not just by the news folks, to the point where it was a contributing factor in my hospitalization. I'm still very jumpy and sometimes only feel safe in my own home with a loaded firearm currently in my lap. I'm psyching myself out. The official reports say she was drunk while driving, but the whole thing seems very, very fishy to me and I suspect there was someone else involved. I'm very familiar with the story. Sorry for your loss and the additional lack of closure with your mom. If I recall correctly, your mom even tried to knock on people's houses to get help but no one answered. So sad. Once I found a cardboard box on the front step to my parents' house. It was taped and looked like a package. I opened it and inside was a VHS tape with the tape cut. I was curious what was on the tape, so I repaired it and stuck it in the VCR. It was a home video of a middle-aged white dude staring into the camera. It was really creepy. I forget if he said anything, but if he did, it didn't make any sense at all. I never figured out who left the tape on the front steps or who the guy was. So strange. After the ferry reached port, the cars all started to drive off. All except one. The driver could not be found anywhere on the ferry. They searched the ship extensively and started thinking the passenger might have jumped and delayed letting the new passengers for the next sailing. It seems like every freaking time I take a ferry this happens. It is no mystery. Stop trying to make it one. Just phone the person the car is registered to and ask them if they took the ferry today and if they possibly forgot something on the ferry. Passengers forget they had driven over all the time and walk off the ferry leaving the car behind. I used to bike to college every day. One week I started noticing the same bike at both my dorm and class bike rack. I never saw the person. Even though I raced back from class, he would always beat me there. I was weirded out and paranoid. Some guy must have waited for me to leave then raced me to class. On the last day I got out of class early and waited by my dorm with my DSLR to prove to my friends that I wasn't crazy and I never saw the guy or his bike again. Lance Armstrong has a weird sense of humor. It was my uncle who used to be a cop in Hong Kong. He was patrolling the street on his own and received a smell complaint call from an apartment building nearby. So he reached the location and met the person who made the complaint and found out where the smell was coming from. He rang the doorbell. A little girl opened the door. As soon as the door was opened, he knew someone's dead. The little girl is about 5-6 years old. My uncle was informed that there were only the little girl and her grandma living in the apartment. They were immigrants from China. My uncle walked into the apartment and noticed that there was a freshly made meal. He went to the room where the smell was coming from and found the woman's dead body. My uncle was puzzled by the freshly made meal because the little girl was not tall enough to reach the stove and the countertop. And it also puzzled him that a little girl could cook. Chinese food is pretty complex in their recipes. When my uncle asked the little girl who made this, she said it was her mother. Later he found out that the little girl's mother died from a stroke about a week ago. He was a cop in Hong Kong 30 years ago until he moved to the US. The only plausible explanation for this is that they had relatives who were secretly taking care of the little girl, but didn't want to get found out because they were illegal immigrants. I used to work at a retirement home and a retired federal agent told me this. In the very beginning of the 20th century there were 9 robberies by a 2-man team in 4 counties in one day. All assumed to be the same 2 guys by eyewitness accounts. The exact same getaway car, guns, outfits and ethnicity. The guys were caught and this was an open and shut case. Except for the fact that the robbers claimed they had only robbed 4 places that day, which seemed odd, so someone looked into the exact timings of the robberies and found that robbery number 4 took place only 10 minutes after robbery 3 and then 1 minute after that robbery 5 happened. So they go back and interview the robbers about this discrepancy and both robbers tell the same story, that they only robbed 4 places. This made me feel like I was reading a math problem. The reason this post has no good stories is because detectives and law enforcement officers who haven't solved mysteries don't post about them on Reddit. That and reality can be rather boring. This isn't unexplainable, as we all know what happened. However, the case is closed and unsolved. My dad, back in October of 1996, in Tazewell, Virginia, was out drinking with some buddies of his as well as a girl, who wasn't my mum, at their house. Apparently he wanted to leave, but the girl wouldn't let him and had her 2 friends rough him up a bit. Apparently things got out of hand and he was knocked unconscious, being drunk, as well as possibly on drugs too. They decided it was a good idea to tie him up and then hit him in the head with a shovel, presumably to make sure he was unconscious. My dad was fairly well built. I guess they were afraid of him waking up during the next stuff and beating them up. He was still alive at this point. They then decided to shove him in their trunk and drive over to his mom's house, break in, hang him by the neck from a wooden beam over the stairs of the house, and then write a suicide note. I think the coroner who examined him concluded that he died from asphyxiation sometime after they killed him. He also said that due to the shovel hit, his brain damage was already so extensive, I guess due to concussion, that had they not hung him and killed him he probably wouldn't have been in very good shape anyway. Tazewell, VA is an extremely small town and I think the nearest hospital at that time wasn't very close. So, yeah, well, this applies to the thread because the sheriff of Tazewell ruled the case a suicide. Disregarding that, A, the note was obviously not in his handwriting. B, everyone who knew him, probably most of the tiny town, knew that he loved life, wasn't depressed and wouldn't commit suicide. C, the marks on his body had from getting beaten by the 2 guys, probably the 1 girl. It was long ago, and I don't know whether he was still tied up when he was hanging. I suppose not, since the druggy friends of his probably weren't totally stupid. But I'll never know because the case is closed and I was only 4 at the time. My grandmother, dad's mom, has written to the sheriff's office many times trying to have the case reopened, but they ignore her. The sheriff is kind of a scumbag, from what I hear. But if the case is closed, how do I know they killed him and it wasn't a suicide? Because those 3 dirtbags told pretty much everyone in the town about it, as well as the girl's kid, who grew up, felt bad about what happened and contacted my family to give more details. They would get drunk at parties, etc. and brag about killing him. Sorry, this is turning into a rant because it's making me furious, so I better stop. Anyways, it's closed and unsolved, whatever. When I was in a freshman dorm, there was a rash of poop microwavings. Now, I don't know if you've ever smelled an area in which a turd has been microwaved, but if you ever do, it's not really something you can forget. It happened, I want to say, 4 times in a month or so. We never caught the culprit. My theory? It was one of the freshmen who lived in the dorm. This kills the microwave. It's like a ghost town in here. Normally there'd be tons of I'm not a detective, but, at the very least, I'm scared. You're right, it's unexplainable. Sounds like we got quite a mystery on our hands. Now I'm not a detective, but, here's my theory. My old driving instructor, we'll call him Steve, was an ex-cop and always loved sharing old stories with us. One of my favorites is one that goes something like this. After a heavy spring rainfall, they've discovered someone had been in an accident. The car had driven through a guardrail on a bridge at a high speed. Steve says the first part to the mystery was to find the car. Confused, we said, why not follow the trail off the side of the bridge? We did. All we found though was the car missing its entire outer frame and bodywork sitting near the bottoms of the ridge with no body. After several hours of searching on the ground, one officer eventually discovers the missing frame sitting up in a tree, still intact. Mystery 1 solved. But where is the body? They continued to search and called in a crew to remove the frame from the tree. When the crew arrived, they had a man climb the tree to connect a wire to a crane. When he reached the car, he was baffled and fell sick. He had found the body, but not hit the frame. The man, because he was traveling so fast, drove through the guardrail, had his frame caught in the tree and crashed through the windshield, hitting the tree so hard with his face that it collapsed in on itself and stuck to the tree. He says it's one of the weirdest things he's ever seen. We get a call that a body has been found inside an apartment. We arrive at the apartment, located in a nicer part of town, and find it is empty. No furniture, only the dissident who rented the place, and a few personal belongings. He was fairly young, mid to late 20s maybe, and looked in decent enough shape. No signs of a struggle save for a small drop of high velocity blood spatter on the wall behind him, and no apparent injuries to the guy. When the medical investigator arrived and did her examination, she found a small, round hole in the base of his head, near the bottom of his hairline. It looked smaller than a .22 sized hole, and there was no bleeding, even after moving the body. None of the neighbors heard any noise the previous night, nor had any of them seen in several days. Nothing appeared overtly suspicious in this case. I tried to follow it after, but it was all but forgotten due to current cases. Never found out what was up with the hole in his neck, what made it. Last I heard, it was still involved and classified as unexplained. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.